Could the Nordic countries survive a war without NATO? What if NATO wasn't an option? No US, no UK, no alliance, just Norway, Sweden and Finland standing alone. Could they defend themselves against a major invasion? And if so, how? Today, we're breaking down their survival strategy, military doctrine, and whether the Nordic alliance could actually hold its own in a real war. By the way, if you want a full breakdown of their military power, jets, tanks, special forces, check out our previous video, link in the description. Section 1. The Nordic Survival Strategy. Winning a war isn't just about having the best weapons, it's about having the best strategy. And when you're outnumbered, strategy is everything. First, terrain and climate are the best natural defense. The Nordic countries are designed for defense. Mountains, dense forests, and extreme winters make large-scale invasions incredibly difficult. Finland's winter war in 1939 is proof. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, the Finns used their knowledge of the terrain to devastate the Soviet forces. Similarly, Norway's fjords and icy terrain make moving heavy armor nearly impossible. Next, decentralized warfare is a key part of Nordic military doctrine. Unlike most countries, the Nordics don't rely on a single defensive line. Instead, they use a distributed defense strategy. Military assets are spread out, hidden in forests, tunnels, and underground bunkers. Sweden even has highway-based airstrips, allowing its air force to relocate constantly. Finally, the porcupine strategy is designed to make an invasion too costly. The goal wouldn't be to overpower an enemy, but to make every inch of land an exhausting, costly battle. Think about the Vietnam War or Afghanistan, where a smaller force used guerrilla tactics to wear down a much larger army. So, the Nordic countries wouldn't try to overpower an enemy, they'd make sure the enemy bleeds for every inch of land. But could they actually sustain a war without NATO? Section 2. Could they fight alone? Without NATO, the biggest challenge isn't weapons, it's logistics, manpower, and industrial capacity. Modern wars burn through massive amounts of ammunition. Ukraine, for example, fires 5,000 artillery shells per day, more than some countries can produce in a year. Sweden and Finland have stockpiles, but without NATO's supply chains, they'd eventually run out. Then there's manpower. Finland has 900,000 trained reserves, which is a huge advantage. But war isn't just about having people. It's about keeping them supplied, fed, and equipped. Without NATO logistics, the Nordics would struggle to sustain a long-term fight. And let's not forget cyber warfare. A modern war wouldn't start with tanks rolling in. It would start online. Cyber attacks on power grids, disinformation campaigns, and economic pressure would weaken the Nordics before a single shot was fired. Sweden and Finland have strong cyber defenses, but against a major state-backed attack, it would be a battle for survival. So, fighting alone would be possible for a while. But what about outside help? Section 3. Could they get help without NATO? Even without NATO, the Nordic countries wouldn't necessarily be alone. Here's who could step in, and who wouldn't. First, there's the EU. Sweden and Finland are members, and the EU has a mutual defense clause. But there's a catch. The EU doesn't have a military. Individual nations could send weapons and economic support, but sending troops? That's another story. Then there's the US and UK. NATO membership or not, the US and UK have deep military ties to the Nordics. The US already has military bases in Norway and a defense pact with Sweden and Finland. Would they ignore an invasion? Unlikely. But without NATO, their response might be slower and more limited. Finally, we have Russia's strategy. Would they even try to invade? Invading the Nordics would be a logistical nightmare for any country. Russia would have to divert massive resources from other fronts, making it an incredibly risky move. And historically, every attempt to invade Scandinavia has ended badly. So, even without NATO, the Nordics wouldn't be completely alone. But their survival would depend on whether help arrives in time. Section 4. The verdict. Can they survive without NATO? So the big question, could the Nordic countries survive a war without NATO? Here's the reality. Yes, they could defend themselves for a while. Their terrain, military strategy, and defensive tactics would make an invasion a nightmare. They'd use guerrilla warfare, cyber attacks, and hidden defenses to wear down an enemy. But no, they couldn't win a long-term war alone. Without NATO logistics and reinforcements, they'd eventually run low on supplies and manpower. Their survival would depend on whether Europe, the US, or the UK stepped in. So while the Nordic countries are some of the best prepared in Europe, their real strength comes from their alliances. Without them, the fight would be brutal. What do you think? Could the Nordic countries survive on their own, or would they eventually fall? Let us know in the comments. And if you want a full breakdown of their military firepower, jets, tanks, special forces, check out our last video. Link in the description. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more military analysis.